Hello friends and fellow world builders, my name is AJ Winters and welcome back to World Builder. Today we're playing around with the races in the land of Aelwyn. We're also going to be playing around with some 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons statistics, even though it's not necessarily relevant to the world building of our world. But I'm so excited to get started, so let's crack in. Alright, so we're going to start with one of the races we have already mentioned in the previous episode on Caldrere, our colder region to the north. We played around with a race called Araturs, which are potential descendants of satyrs and minotaurs. I'd like to play around with a race that has a hoof and horn situation as well as short fur. Large muscular types with goat, bull, or even moose features. Their shorter fur is coloured in whites, browns, greys, and blacks, or even a two-toned combo. They can even grow hair, manes, or beards. Maybe we can even play around with some tail variations too. These incredibly muscular creatures can grow to be 6.5 foot to 7.5 feet tall. And they have a lifespan comparable to humans, so they grow to be mature at around late teens, early 20s, and live to about a century long. Something we don't necessarily talk about when we're creating races in Dungeons & Dragons or other tabletop RPGs is actually the breeding structure and/or pregnancies of certain races. We don't really get into it when we talk about Dungeons & Dragons, but there are some races that can breed with each other and some that can't, similar to that of a lion and a tiger. When you end up with a liger, they become infertile and can't procreate from there. So the question becomes, can Araturs breed with other races, or does an Aratur only produce an Aratur? In order for them to breed with other races, they need a similar gestational period as well as compatible genetics. I've been playing around with the idea that an Aratur's gestational period is slightly longer than a human's, as when the babies are born, they're able to look after themselves a little bit better. I also like the idea that the Aratur females grow thicker fur during their pregnancy in order to keep the embryo warm. This makes me think that maybe, just maybe, an Aratur and a human would be able to conceive a child, which would mean there are half Araturs as well. I like it. Also, I think that an Aratur's diet would need to be predominantly high protein to keep up muscle mass. So maybe they have regular meats that they eat, and they can eat a plant-based diet, but it's less important to them. So if we translate this into Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, then statistically speaking, these creatures would kind of be like a reskinned Goliath. I imagine that they have a +2 to strength and a +1 to con, as well as the fact that they would be cold resistant as they live in the cold icy tundras of Caldrere. And then lastly, their base walking speed would be around 30, and I also think that they would have advantage in difficult terrain based on the fact that they're an incredibly resilient race. So that's our basic Araturs. Let's move on to the next race we've been playing around with, which is our Traven. Traven are a people that were created after the War of the Gods in Natreva. When the magic was siphoned away from the region, the people that existed in the area were changed into people made of obsidian, meaning that the people have crystalline skin of blacks to dark browns with color lacing underneath the same way that volcanic glass would. And because their skin is made of a volcanic glass structure, I wanted to play around with some elements of that as well. For example, I believe that their skin would end up being stronger the longer it was left in fire, meaning that I think the race in general is fire resistant, something we've talked about previously, and that when it is in fire, it ends up being a little bit more malleable. With this being the case, I think that the Traven would culturally visit spas or locations where they could lie on hot rocks, maybe even fire. With this conditioning, their skin would end up being harder as well as more prominent in color, like a tanning bed. I like that. Given that their skin is also more malleable during fire, it makes me think about the pregnancy process for a Traven. I've been playing around with the idea that a pregnant female actually gives birth in a fire pit, where their skin is able to be more malleable as the baby is born. The baby itself would also be molten rock. Maybe it even gives off a soft glow from within the mother as it grows. Which means that maybe the baby is even dipped in water after it's birthed so that it hardens the skin. Also, I think this could mean that maybe the temperature would affect the coloring of the baby. For example, if the baby was born in winter, similar to how volcanic rock works, if it cools faster, the underneath colors of the skin would be blues or violets. That would mean that potentially the different seasons would affect the coloring of children. You could have all different types of seasonal births which would produce different colors in the Traven. Yeah. But with this being the case, it would mean that Travens would need to regulate their temperature, especially since they could be more valuable in fire. So it makes me think that maybe the Traven have a slower heart rate to humans, meaning that they can probably slow down their heart rate to stay cool, and be able to do strenuous activity for slightly longer than a human would be able to do. Also, that would mean that colder temperatures would absolutely suck for a Traven. So let's throw a 5th edition spin on it. I think that being a hardier race, they would have +2 to Constitution, as well as potentially +1 to Intelligence. This would be kind of a re-skinning of a fire genasi per se, so I think we should play around with giving them dark vision, based on the fact that they are crystalline and can maybe reflect light? Actually, that gives me a really interesting thought. Maybe we could play around with an ability, like a cantrip of some kind, where they could actually refract light through their crystalline form. They would be able to give the illusion that their body is in a different position than they are actually based, which works really well for combat, unless they're in darkness, because they would probably reflect any kind of light in the vicinity. Yeah, I really like that. I'm just going to call that refraction as a cantrip. And speaking of dark vision, I don't think that this volcanic crystalline race would have whites in their eyes. So I think that similar to a tiefling, they could be entire color, or maybe even black before they get to the iris. And I think that the eye colors would be genetic, passed on from mother to child, whereas the colorings underneath the skin would be based on when you were born. I really like the Traven, but let's dive into our next race. Okay, I have been mentioning this a few times in our weekly world building streams on the Winter's Tales Twitch channel, but I want to play around with some sort of insectoid race. Something that has exoskeleton parts as well as soft fleshy bits, kind of like a slater or a tumblebug. Tumblebug? No, roly-poly. What is it called? Pillbug. I also want to play around with having antennae and nictitating membranes, kind of like lizard meets bug. And I think if we're going to play around with a insectoid bug race, however humanoid they might be in features, that we might play around with a herbivorous diet, meaning that they would have flatter teeth for eating plants, fruits, and maybe even craving some sort of nectar, the way that insects collect pollen from flowers. Yeah, I like that. I also like the idea that some of the species can actually grow wings, though they don't necessarily fly, more gliding with style. Now, given we've talked about pregnancy and birth with the other 2 races, maybe we should dive into how this insectoid race multiply. Now, most insects lay eggs. However, given that this race has humanoid features, I want to say that they carry the babies internally too. I want to play around with a shorter gestational period, meaning that when the babies are born, they need more care. And given the fact that they're insects, I don't think that they would behave the same way mammals do with breastfeeding. So maybe the plant-based, nectar-based process is how they provide for their young. Now, translating this insectoid race into Dungeons and Dragons, I feel like they would have +2 to dexterity, particularly because they are a nimble species. Also, I think that they would have a +1 to wisdom because of their innate sensing of the world around them. And that would also translate to dark vision given the fact that they have sensory perception using said antenna. That makes sense. Also, given the fact that some of them have wings, I think I want to give them 5 to 10 feet in flying speed. But we don't have a name for this race yet, so that comes down to you. If you have any suggestions for an Insectoid Ilk, then leave it down below in the comments. Now, because we've wanted to play around with a bug race, I've also tossed around the ideas of a flower race, and we've been playing with the name Evantheme. But what do we mean when we say plant race? Well, if you take a look at folklore, looking at your dryads or your tree ants, then you're heading in the right direction of what we're thinking. Basically, I want to play around with a gender-neutral flower race, people that grow flowers from their skin, as well as change their reproductive organs based on the needs of the individual. This makes for a really interesting playable race. I think their skin color would range in shades of greens and browns, whereas their hair color would act more like the petals of a flower and be able to grow in a variety of different colors. I've also been playing around with the idea that the people of this race sprout flowers, either seasonally or cyclically. Yep, that was correct. Based on their hormones, specifically in areas that are more vascular, around the neck, elbows, knees, ankles, that sort of thing. Also, it could be a fun idea if the plants changed color. Or maybe dietary choices might affect the coloring of the petals. Maybe even the hair too, similar to that of a flower sucking up food dye into its formation. Yeah, I like that. And speaking of formation, let's dive a little bit more into the pregnancy route of this race. If we're playing around with a gender-neutral race that changed their genitalia based on the needs of the individual, that would mean that procreation is still a thing. So maybe the females, or the females that have been transformed into females, can be pollinated and then give birth to some sort of bud that they then plant in the ground. Maybe there's even a field of budding flowers where these children are being grown. It would also mean that the area is incredibly looked after. I think that would mean that these giant flowers, as big as they become, would open up to reveal a quite self-sufficient toddler instead of a baby, meaning that the gestational period of these flower race would be longer than a human's. Which makes me also think that a human and a flower person can't procreate together. Nor can a human and a bug race. Nor can a human and a Traven, given the fact that they're volcanic glass. But going back to the Evantheme, I think that maybe the diet of an Evantheme would be more plant-based. Unless they were kind of like a carnivorous plant in some aspects, like a Venus flytrap. Maybe with retractable fangs? Yeah, I like that idea. Maybe they have some sort of dissolving and/or numbing saliva that allows them to then feed off animals or even people? Having sort of vampiric tendencies. Yeah. And that makes a really interesting subplot line in regards to this race, because they could have like alluring qualities to them. They are flowers, so they might smell good. But given that they are flowers, maybe they could also survive semi or photosynthesis as well. Yeah, I think that their diet must consist of water and sunlight, similar to that of a plant, as well as plants and fruits and occasional bits of meat, unless they become addicted, because I feel like there is the pathway for the Evantheme to become a little bit more predatory. And now, let's translate that into Dungeons and Dragons. So, I think that being that they are an alluring species, they would have +2 to charisma, as well as the fact I want to give them +1 to wisdom. I think being plants, they would have sort of an innate connection to nature, as well as maybe sensory aspects. And in regards to their changeable form, I feel like it can take up to an hour for them to transition. And I also think that they would only be able to do this once per long rest, as it is exhausting and would leave their body quite sore. And speaking of body, I feel like because they are a plant species that they would be incredibly frail. So I'm going to add a -1 to Constitution. But I've been playing around with a fun little feature for our Evantheme too. I want to add in a reaction. I'm calling it ground roots. Basically what it translates to is an Avanthome is able to plant themselves in the ground, unable to be knocked prone, as well as recover 1 hit point every round that they stay grounded. However, if they're inside a castle and there isn't organic matter below them, they would be unable to use this reaction. In the future, we could also play around with different variants of this race too. For example, a desert flower or more of a bark-like subspecies, but we'll get to that in the future. Finally, there's one more race I want to talk about in the land of Aelwyn. Genetically speaking, any combination of other races not deemed to be human are deemed daemon. We're talking your elves, your dwarves, your gnomes, your halflings, that kind of thing. They can range in height and skin color and usually have pointed ears. So in terms of skin color, we're talking blues, greens, oranges, reds, whatever it may be. And statistically speaking, they don't have stats, as they are an amalgamation of other races, meaning you can mix and match what you like. This gives us a lot of room to play in terms of roleplay, as we don't want to fix into Dungeons & Dragons too much. We want this world to be malleable. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode. I am so excited to dabble into these playable races later on down the track. If you enjoyed the content, then please give this video a like and follow the channel so you get updated when new videos come out. If you want to be part of the community and get access to daily world building prompts, then you can join our Discord. Or if you want access to behind the scenes as well as downloadable PDFs of anything we create on this channel, then you can support us through Patreon. Or maybe you're a fellow world builder and you want to join us every Tuesday night 8 PM AWST on twitch.tv/winterstales for our weekly world building session. We're also on all of the social media, so if you want to see this journey of how this world is coming together, as well as the upcoming tabletop RPG show, then follow us somewhere in there. This world is really starting to come together now, and I'm so excited to get into the nuances of all the different regions. But until then, I'll see you next week.